Boom! The cannons of Fort Point. Looking at the huge structure that is Fort Point, we wonder, why was it built and why here, in such a cold, uncomfortable place? Sure, the view from this site is beautiful, but military experts never pick sites for their scenic value alone. The answer is that Fort Point was designed and built at the narrowest point of the straits, right at the entrance to the San Francisco Bay, to protect the city and other communities around the bay from potentially hostile foreign or domestic invaders. Remember, this fort was built just before the beginning of our Civil War, which began in 1861. California was expected to enter the war on the side of the Union, and there was always a danger that Southern forces would try and capture the bay and the city. The Union Army and Navy were charged with preventing that from occurring. Together, they developed a plan to build a number of forts around the bay to safeguard San Francisco. Fort Point was just one of them, but it was the largest and most ambitious of the planned bases. Standing on the southern shore of the Straits of San Francisco, the men had many vantage points from which they could watch for ships entering their harbor. At full capacity, over 100 heavy guns armed the fort. Multiple cannons could be aimed at a single incoming enemy ship. This overlapping of guns was essential because it took so long to reload and fire a cannon after each use. If another cannon was not ready to be fired, an invading ship could sail out of harm's way before the soldiers could attack it. Besides that, aiming a cannon was anything but an exact science. The soldiers and their commanding officers knew that a certain number of their shots were going to miss their targets. In theory, any ship that managed to escape from the cannon fire at Fort Point would then be fired upon by the men stationed on Alcatraz and Angel Island, thereby ensuring the safety of the harbor and the city. As the Civil War progressed, there were several modifications to ships and cannons that would eventually make coastal forts like Fort Point obsolete. Ironclad ships were built that could not be sunk by enemy fire. An armored ship could sit relatively still, unthreatened by the cannons of the fort, and hammer away at the fort's walls until they crumbled. The millions of bricks and hundreds of thousands of tons of granite that were used to build Fort Point would have been no match for that kind of attack. Fortunately, Fort Point never had to defend San Francisco from enemy ships. In fact, the only threat to the fort happened early in the war, and it would come not from the waters of the San Francisco Bay, but from land. In 1846, when the U.S. took control of California and San Francisco from the Spanish government, there were about 500 people living in the city. 3 years later, because of the gold rush, there were about 35,000 people living here. It's estimated that 30 to 40% of this new population in California had been born in the South and sympathized with the Southern cause. In 1861, a number of these Southerners formed a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle and developed a plan to attack Fort Point and Alcatraz. They hoped to turn these forts over to the Confederacy, creating an entry for the South into wealthy California. Ironically, the commanding officer of the Army's forces in the West at that time was Kentucky-born Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston. The Southerners in the conspiracy thought that because this colonel was a Southerner, like them, he would be sympathetic to their demands and aid their cause. But they were wrong. He told them that his soldiers would defend Fort Point and Alcatraz with cannons and rifles if the Knights of the Southern Circle tried to attack his forts. Colonel Johnston had sworn an oath of allegiance to defend the United States, and it was against his sense of honor to aid a rebellion against the Union. Shortly after the Civil War broke out, however, he resigned his commission and joined the Confederacy, dying at the Battle of Shiloh while fighting on the side of the South. Fort Point would spend the rest of the Civil War never having to face battle. Any damage we see today on the outside of this building comes from the ravages of wind and tidal action and constant exposure to salt spray. There are still a few cannons on display here at Fort Point on the ground floor of this building, under the arches around the parade ground. They represent a cross-section of 19th century artillery. Most of the cannon emplacements, however, are empty, silent reminders of a different era's defense system. The phrase Homeland Security may be the words we use today as we speak of protecting our nation, but the concept of protecting our borders and our civilians is not a new one. Because the ways of protecting ourselves have changed, we can make old forts like this one that depend on cannons part of our national parks. A site like Fort Point can be a window into our past, a place where we can imagine what life was like in another century. If you would like to know more about how cannons were used, have a look at one of our other videos, Ready, Aim, Fire: How to Fire a Cannon.